Okay, so welcome to lecture 2 for topic 11. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about the death penalty. The most severe sentence used in the United States, as we all know, is capital punishment. As your textbook shows, the capital punishment has been used in the United States since the 1600s. So we have a long history of the use of capital punishment in the United States. However, we're kind of an outlier when it comes to other countries like us, sort of like our allies and other advanced democracies. Uh, Many countries in the world, according to the Death Penalty Information Center, more than 70% of the world's countries have abolished capital punishment, either by law or that they just don't use it anymore in terms of practice. And as I mentioned, that when you look at the United States in comparison to other countries like us, we're pretty much an outlier in terms of continuing to use the death penalty. But it's our country, it's our laws, and we do make decisions according to what we think is best for our country, not other countries. Some might argue. It's about split in terms of the number of states that have the death penalty and the number that do not. 27 states have the death penalty. 23 states do not use the death penalty, don't have the death penalty. Wisconsin, as we know, does not have the death penalty. And of those 27 states that use the death penalty, there's a governor, gubernatorial. The governor of that state has imposed a moratorium on the use of the death penalty. Okay, and so even though there's 27 states that have it on the books, 3 of those 27 don't use it because they are concerned about the arbitrary use of it or the racial bias. Here is a map that shows, this is again from the Death Penalty Information Center, that this is a map that shows you the states in the United States that have the death penalty or don't have the death penalty. States that are in red are death penalty states. States that are in blue are not, they don't have the death penalty. And then those 3 states in purple, California, New York, and I think that is Oregon, that they have a moratorium on the use of the death penalty. So they have it on the books, but they don't use it anymore. Notice some regional differences here in terms of the death penalty. That when it comes to death penalty use or executions since the reinstatement of the death penalty, which we'll talk about in a second, in the mid-1970s, that the vast majority of executions take place in, let me put on the magic pen here, in the South and in the West. Okay, the Northeast and the Midwest don't use the death penalty, so obviously they aren't instituting executions. So the vast majority of the executions that we have come from, obviously, the states that still use the death penalty. Okay, so this graph shows you the number of executions that have taken place in the United States over time since 1976. Okay, so let me use my magic pen here. And that number is 1,532. Now, one thing, if I had asked you, how many executions do you think have taken place in the last 45 plus years? How might you have responded to that? Would you think that number would have been a lot higher than that number, like 20,000? Or would you thought it would have been more like 300? Like maybe just a couple people executed each year. So, keep that in mind in terms of what your perception of the number of executions versus the reality of executions. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk about how the Supreme Court placed a moratorium on the use of the death penalty in 1973 until 1976. We'll talk about why that is in a second. And then this just shows you sort of the trending back up. So states had to change their laws in order to get in compliance with the Supreme Court ruling, which we'll talk about. Then we see a high mark in terms of the number of executions in 1999 at 98. We'll talk about why that is in a second. And then we've seen a pretty steady decline in the use of the death penalty to where we are today in 2021. And so, think about this in relationship to crime rates in the United States. Keep in mind, remember that we saw the highest level of crimes in the late 1980s and the 1990s, and there was this policy response to it, right? The 1994 omnibus crime bill under the Bill Clinton administration that that actually increased the number of crimes that are death penalty eligible, and a lot of states sort of followed suit. And it was also sort of this tough on crime time period in the United States. But crime has been on the decline in the United States, and so that you have maybe less people who are eligible for the death penalty, and also just maybe changing attitudes towards the death penalty as well. And so this is just a nice slide that shows you that changing trend over time. So in the United States, we have this thing called the Bill of Rights. Y'all are familiar with that. And in the Bill of Rights, the Eighth Amendment tells us that excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. And it's been up to the Supreme Court to basically define what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Now, for you civil liberties students in this class who are in crime and politics and also in civil liberties, we're going to get into the weeds next week on the death penalty and what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. For the most part, what the Supreme Court looks at is proportionality, that for a punishment to be considered cruel and unusual, it needs to be disproportionate to the crime. And so that if you, for example, shoplift, and then the sentence is chopping off the hand of the shoplifter, that would violate the Eighth Amendment, because one would think, because the sentence is completely disproportionate. It's much harsher than the crime that has been committed. And so the use of the death penalty has come to the Supreme Court two major times and some other times since then, sort of asking the question about whether or not the death penalty constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. And as it says there, the Supreme Court has ruled that the death penalty does not constitute cruel and unusual punishment. It doesn't violate the Eighth Amendment. There are two cases that your textbook talks about. You don't really need to know the details of the case, okay? But what you need to know about there's two cases. One is Furman v. Georgia, and the other is the Gregg case that we'll talk about on the next slide. That in this case, this was Furman was burglarizing a private home. The family members woke up and they discovered him. According to him, he was attempting to flee. And in attempting to flee, his weapon discharged because he tripped and fell, and he killed one of the family members. And he was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. And Furman v. Georgia is a case that looks at whether or not the imposition of the death penalty is unconstitutional, whether it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, in large part because that in Furman v. Georgia, the people representing Furman at the Supreme Court, they entered in all of this evidence about just how arbitrary the imposition of the death penalty is from state to state. So there was no set kind of crimes that were eligible for the death penalty. In one state, it would have to be intentional homicide to get the death penalty. But in the case of Furman, this sort of accidental homicide, right? Probably not first degree intentional, but yet he was death penalty eligible. In some states, they were giving the death penalty for not where there was no homicide, right? And so really it was sort of like arbitrary, depending on what state you lived in, you could get the death penalty. In another state, you wouldn't get the death penalty for the same offense. And so the court looked at that and said, wait a second, the arbitrary and capricious nature of the imposition of the death penalty seems to violate the principles of due process, and violating the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment, because there's no continuity in terms of the imposition. And then also that they presented significant evidence of racial bias in the Furman v. Georgia case, that basically African American offenders were much more likely to get the death penalty, particularly if they killed a white person, right? And so the person most likely to get the death penalty was a black person who killed a white person. the person least likely to get the death penalty would be a white person who killed a black person, okay? And looking at that aggregate data and the evidence of racial bias, the Supreme Court said, whoa, let's take a pause here in terms of the imposition of the death penalty. And so they basically said that the decision in Furman outlaws the use of the death penalty as currently practiced, okay? They said the way it's currently practiced is arbitrary and capricious, violates due process, and ultimately is cruel and unusual punishment because people are getting random sentences of death for all practical purposes. And so but to keep an important aspect of Furman, obviously, since we use the death penalty today, is that while they had a plurality of justices who wanted to say that the death penalty in itself was inherently cruel and unusual, they didn't have a majority of the justices actually determine that. You need a majority of the justices of the Supreme Court to have it be the law of the land, right? To say the majority of the court says it's cruel and unusual punishment inherently, the death penalty is. They rejected that. They didn't have enough justices on the bench to do that. So for all practical purposes, the Supreme Court put a moratorium on the use of the death penalty, the way it was currently practiced, but they rejected the broader claim that the death penalty in and of itself is inherently cruel and unusual. They basically said that the majority of the court said with changes, the death penalty could still be used, okay? So after the ruling in Furman, a lot of states made changes to the way that they imposed the death penalty. Because remember, Furman basically said that the death penalty is not inherently cruel and unusual punishment, just the way that it's imposed is inherently cruel and unusual. But with changes that the death penalty could be used again. And so in the case Gregg versus Georgia, this is a case about the changes that Georgia made to their laws regarding the imposition of the death penalty, but then bringing the question back to the court about whether or not the death penalty is in and of itself, even with the changes, inherently cruel and unusual punishment. And so that in Gregg versus Georgia, the court basically said that that the death penalty is not inherently cruel and unusual. They said that that as long as the death penalty is used for specific and limited numbers of crimes, and also if it's imposed in a way that is rise to sort of a more knowable and fair procedure, then it's allowable. And that's exactly what Georgia had done. In Georgia had said that that to get the death penalty, there were only certain offenses that were eligible for the death penalty: multiple killings, homicide in the course of a commission of a felony, the killing of a police officer. And Gregg had committed armed robbery and murder. Okay, so he murdered somebody in the commission of a felony and armed robbery, and that's what got him the death penalty. Other steps that Georgia had put in place was that there were safeguards put in place against arbitrary sentencing, and that they used the two-step process, the bifurcated trial. And so, as I had mentioned in the last slide, in the role that the jury plays in the death penalty, that in capital offense cases, you have one trial that determines whether this person is guilty of the capital offense, and another sort of sentencing trial that determines the jury determines whether or not the punishment for being found guilty of the offense should be the death penalty. And that's what Georgia and other states had instituted. And so basically that the Supreme Court said that with these kinds of changes, the death penalty is no longer arbitrary and capricious. It's following a known process. It's limited to certain kinds of heinous crimes, and therefore it is in fact constitutional. That being said, that even though the death penalty can be used, the Supreme Court has placed some limitations on that, two major limitations since 1976. A case came to the Supreme Court about whether or not somebody who is mentally insane or mentally retarded, and that's the language that the court uses, and that's why I have that on there. They say that an individual who can be demonstrated as either mentally insane or mentally retarded, very low IQ, cannot be executed for their crime. And also, a youth cannot be executed for their crime as an adult. Let me rephrase. So if you commit a capital offense under the age of 18, you can't be executed, even though by the point of time where you're going to get executed, you could be 30 years old, right? Death penalty cases take a long time because there's lots of checks on the power of the state. So, bottom line is that you cannot be executed if the capital offense was committed before the age of 18. Although we found out this week that you can be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, even though the Supreme Court had previously put limits on that. So that's where we stand in terms of the Supreme Court and the Eighth Amendment and the use of the death penalty. So this week for our online discussion, you're going to get to basically watch, I think, a great movie called Dead Man Walking. And then you're going to get to debate the death penalty. Okay, so let me talk about it in a little bit more detail. So as it says there, this week you'll be watching the movie Dead Man Walking. Dead Man Walking stars Sean Penn and Susan Sarandon. The movie's about 20 years old, but it's a great movie. And the movie is based on an actual experience of an individual. So as it says there, it's based on the book by Sister Helen Prejean. She's a Catholic nun. And whether you know it or not, the Catholic Church is against the use of the death penalty, right? The Catholic Church is against abortion. They have this idea of the full cloth of life, that only God can take away life, right? So they're against, Catholics are against the abortion. Catholics are also against the use of the death penalty as well. And so Sister Helen Prejean was a Catholic nun, and she was actually spent some of her time, as some Catholic nuns do, protesting the use of the death penalty. But that there's this man, his name is Matthew Poncelet, and you'll find that he was convicted of a very heinous crime, and he's sentenced to death. He's a death row inmate. And he's allowed to select a spiritual advisor. And he selects Sister Helen Prejean to be his spiritual advisor as he works his way towards a potential death penalty. You'll find out whether he actually gets executed in the movie. So it's based on her experience as serving as a spiritual advisor for somebody who's on death row. So the reason I'm having you watch this movie, and I've done this assignment usually in the non-COVID times, we'll watch the movie over the lunch hour, get pizza, whatever, and then there will be an opportunity in class to discuss the movie. And why I show this movie is because this movie when you watch it, it makes a really good case in favor of the death penalty, right? It also makes a really good case against the use of the death penalty. So I've seen this movie many times, and every time I see it, I'm just like, I walk out of there going, yep, we should use the death penalty. And then other times I'm like, nope, we shouldn't use the death penalty. So it kind of, it makes a good sort of, not argument, but it shows the situation in a way that makes it not clear cut and dry. It shows that there's a lot of gray in terms of the use or not use of the death penalty. So for the discussion this week, that you'll get an opportunity to talk about ways in which the death penalty or the movie is pro-death penalty, ways in which the movie is anti-death penalty. And then in your textbook, there's a listing of, and we're not going to talk about it in lecture, but there's a listing of like 6 arguments in favor of the death penalty, 6 arguments opposed to the death penalty. And I will ask you in the discussion, of the 6 in favor, which did you think were the most compelling? Of the 6 opposed, which did you think were the most compelling? And then I'll ask you, how is this movie a movie in favor of the death penalty? How is a movie opposed to the death penalty? And then I'll ask you where you stand on the death penalty. Okay. So, there's a free link to the movie. It's 2 hours long. It's an emotional roller coaster. So kind of be prepared for it. It's not violent or anything, but it's very emotional. And feel free to watch it with your family or your friends or your siblings or whatever. I mean, age-appropriate siblings. Okay. So anyways, thanks for your time. Appreciate you listening to all these rambling lectures all semester long. We've got one more week to go. So thanks.